I'm working on the role of the European Court of Human Rights as a vaccine against authoritarian populism. Can the European Convention on Human Rights provide the service it was set up for? After the Second World War, European states agreed to this treaty to keep states from backsliding into authoritarian or populist regimes that disregard the human rights of their population and reject the rule of law. Over time, the European Court of Human Rights has changed this role. But at the same time, over the last decades, we have seen a growth of exactly such movements. In effect, they amount to a stress test of the European human rights system. So what can the court do? It should prevent, or at least constrain, national governments when they try to remove constitutional constraints on what they can do, and when they try to make the courts less independent. And of course also, when they try to make elections less fair, so that the government can constrain the freedoms and human rights of individuals in the name of the true will of the population. An international court, such as the European Court of Human Rights, would seem to be a bad solution to these sorts of important problems. After all, its main task is only to make judgments about whether the state violates the Human Rights Convention, and it cannot force an unwilling state to comply. But still, that court is one of few tools available to channel international concern about human rights. As a political philosopher, I draw on expertise in political science and law to answer this question. I think it is not wise to ask the court to be less strict and let states get away with human rights violations simply because they want to. What are some of the tools and some of the strategies that the court can use? I mainly explore how its judgments and comments can strengthen human rights allies within the state, namely independent courts, where they still exist, political parties, and groups in civil society. First, the court might mobilize these groups even more by how the court argues its judgments. Secondly, the court can require the state to explain why it limits human rights, also so that the citizens can assess the credibility of their own government. Thirdly, the court can refer to how other states in Europe respect their minorities and their own courts. And finally, the court may be more clear about its own role. The judgments should perhaps make even more clear that the court is not the conscience of Europe against all forms of nationalism and national values. Instead, its task is to help the states, the domestic courts and parties, and the citizens, so that the national culture respects human rights and the rule of law.